June 3, 1942, before dawn, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The air over the harbor was already thick and still as the first light came up. 6 months after the Japanese attack, the scars hadn't faded. Battleships sat propped in dry dock. Cranes leaned over broken piers, and nobody who worked at Pearl Harbor needed reminding of what had happened there. But the fight that actually mattered that morning wasn't happening on any flight deck. It was happening in a basement. At Station HYPO, desks sagged under notebooks, code sheets, and half-finished number columns. Cigarette smoke hung under the lights, while men who hadn't slept properly in days stared down columns of 5-digit numbers, hunting for a pattern. Every intercepted Japanese transmission might hold a clue, or it might hold nothing at all. Thousands of miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had no reason to doubt his security. His combined fleet moved under what he believed was total secrecy, every order, every rendezvous point, every fuel stop encrypted in a naval code the Japanese called JN-25, a system they trusted completely. They were wrong. In that basement beneath Pearl Harbor, a small group of American codebreakers had already started reading pieces of a plan Japan assumed no one could touch. If they'd read it correctly, the next great naval battle of the Pacific might already be decided before a single plane left a carrier deck. 2. Historical Background Part 1. The war in the Pacific didn't start at Pearl Harbor. It had been building for years. Imperial Japan had been pushing across East Asia and the Western Pacific well before December 1941, chasing the oil, rubber, and territory its military leadership considered essential. As Japanese forces moved through China, into French Indochina, and toward Southeast Asia, the Imperial Japanese Navy carried the weight of that expansion. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, all of it held together by radio. Those radio transmissions ran through JN-25, and it wasn't a simple cipher. Instead of swapping letters, JN-25 used tens of thousands of 5-digit code groups, each one standing in for a word, a phrase, a place, a unit. Before a message went out, operators layered on another set of random digits pulled from separate additive tables, so what an enemy intercepted looked like pure noise, meaningless numbers, nothing more. The Japanese Navy had good reason to trust it. Even if someone worked out what a handful of code groups meant, the additive layer made piecing together a full message brutally slow, and the codebooks changed periodically anyway, which reset the clock on anyone trying to crack it. Inside the Navy, faith in JN-25 was close to absolute. The whole system of operational secrecy rested on the assumption that nobody outside Japan could read it. The US Navy had been quietly working the other side of that problem for years. Intercept stations ran from Hawaii to the Philippines to the mainland, recording Japanese naval traffic around the clock, day after day. Most of it sat unread. But it got filed, compared, cross-referenced. The cryptanalysts doing this work understood something the history books tend to gloss over. Breaking a code is almost never one big discovery. It's slow accumulation, fragments, patterns, small pieces that eventually click into place. By early 1942, with Japan still riding a wave of victories across the Pacific, that slow accumulation was starting to pay off. At Pearl Harbor, a small unit called Station HYPO was closing in on what many considered the most secure naval code on Earth. 2. Historical Background Part 2. Station HYPO sat beneath the headquarters of the 14th Naval District, and it looked nothing like a battlefield. No guns, no flight decks, no marching men, just cramped rooms stuffed with filing cabinets, stacks of intercepted logs, codebooks, and chalkboards covered in numbers. The war being fought down there ran on math, language, and stubbornness. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran the unit, and he was one of the most capable cryptanalysts the Navy had. He also understood something crucial. No one person breaks a code like JN-25 alone. His team pulled together linguists, mathematicians, traffic analysts, radio operators, each one working a different angle. While one group hunted for repeating numerical patterns, another tracked call signs, routing habits, transmission timing, even something as small as how long a message ran, or what time it went out, could tell you something. Cracking JN-25 wasn't like finding one right combination on a safe. It was closer to rebuilding a book from missing pages, except the author kept switching languages halfway through. Every time the Japanese rolled out new additive tables or revised the codebook, months of work threatened to become useless overnight. But every fresh intercept also handed the Americans new material, a slow trade where the Japanese changed the puzzle and the Americans kept solving more of it anyway. HYPO wasn't working in isolation. Either intelligence moved between Pearl Harbor, OP-20G in Washington, and other Allied intercept posts scattered across the Pacific. Stack enough intercepted transmissions side by side, and patterns start to surface, not every message, but enough to see the shape of what was coming before it arrived. Then, in the spring of 1942, one designation kept showing up in the decrypted fragments, AF. Some upcoming Japanese operation was aimed at it. Nobody could say for certain where it was. Some analysts guessed the Aleutians, others thought somewhere much farther south. Rochefort had a different read on it entirely. If he was right, the next battle of the Pacific War would be fought at Midway Atoll, and proving that would take one of the boldest gambles of American naval intelligence in the entire war. 3. Main Story Part 1. By the spring of 1942, Japan had strung together an impressive run of victories. But Yamamoto knew the war was far from settled. The American carriers had slipped away untouched on December 7, and as long as they stayed afloat, they were a threat he couldn't ignore. His answer was ambitious. Draw the surviving American carriers into a decisive fight near Midway Atoll, a speck of land roughly 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Once the US fleet rushed to defend it, Japan's combined fleet would crush it, clearing the last real obstacle to Japanese control of the Pacific. Every stage of that plan depended on JN-25 holding. Fleet orders, rendezvous coordinates, attack timetables, all of it moved across the airwaves in 5-digit code groups, and Japanese commanders had no reason to think anyone could read them fast enough to matter. At Station HYPO, though, the outline of the plan was already surfacing. Rochefort's team had pulled enough of JN-25 apart to keep spotting AF in message after message. Something big was coming. What they didn't have was proof of what AF actually was, and the stakes on that answer were enormous. Get it right, and Admiral Chester Nimitz could set an ambush. Get it wrong, and the US fleet might sail into the trap itself or leave the real target wide open. Not everyone in the Navy bought Rochefort's red. Officers in Washington leaned toward a different location entirely, and the disagreement climbed all the way up the chain of command. Nimitz needed something more solid than a hunch before he committed his ships. The fix came from Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, one of Rochefort's staff, who suggested something almost too simple: bait the Japanese into confirming it themselves. Midway would send an uncoded radio message, deliberately unencrypted, claiming its freshwater distillation plant had broken down and the garrison was running short on drinking water. If the Japanese picked it up, which they were expected to, their own reaction would give the answer away. It cost almost nothing to try, and it promised a clean answer either way. On May 22nd, 1942, Midway sent the fake message. Then everyone at HYPO waited. It didn't take long. Japanese encrypted traffic carried back a short line, and once the cryptanalysts worked through it, the meaning was unmistakable. AF is short of water. Rochefort had been right all along. One sentence closed out weeks of grinding cryptographic work and one calculated bluff. The mystery around AF was gone. The target was Midway, and the timeline for Japan's attack was starting to come into focus. With that confirmation in hand, Nimitz made the call that would define the battle. Instead of waiting to react, he'd move his carriers into position quietly and let Yamamoto sail into a fight he thought he'd already won. 3. Main Story Part 2. Nimitz knew exactly what kind of opportunity this was. If HYPO's intelligence held up, the US Navy could pull off something rare in naval warfare, meeting a surprise attack with a defense that was already set up and waiting. The hard part was getting his ships into position without tipping his hand. The numbers weren't in his favour. Pearl Harbor had already cost the Pacific Fleet heavily, and only 3 fleet carriers were available for this fight: Enterprise, Hornet, and a badly beaten-up Yorktown. Yorktown had taken serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, and the Japanese assumed she was either sunk or stuck in dry dock for months. They assumed wrong. At Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, engineers looked at Yorktown expecting a long repair job. Instead, thousands of sailors and civilian workers pulled off something close to a miracle. They had her patched up and combat ready in about 72 hours. It wasn't a full repair, far from it, but it didn't need to be. On May 30, Yorktown steamed out to join Enterprise and Hornet, handing Nimitz a 3rd carrier the Japanese didn't know existed. While the American fleet slipped quietly into position northeast of Midway, Yamamoto's combined fleet was already moving a sprawling, carefully staged operation. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo's 1st Air Fleet, built around the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would open with the strike on Midway. Behind them came battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support ships, stretched across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Yamamoto had no doubt surprise was still on his side. Why would he? His plan assumed the Americans wouldn't know anything was coming until Midway was already under attack, that US carriers would then scramble toward the island, walking straight into Nagumo's ambush. It was a plan built entirely on the assumption that his communications were secure. They weren't. Before sunrise on June 4, Japanese planes lifted off Nagumo's decks and hit Midway hard. Bombs tore through airfields, fuel depots, defensive positions. The island took damage, but it kept functioning. American pilots flew desperate. Costly counterattacks that cost them heavily, but still forced Nagumo into an increasingly messy tactical spot. Then came word he hadn't planned for: American ships, spotted nearby. Nagumo now had a genuine problem. Planes from the Midway strike needed to land, refuel, ram, and at the same time his reserve aircraft were mid-changeover, being rearmed for a possible second hit on the island. Conflicting scouting reports kept coming in. His flight decks turned into a crowded mess of fueled planes, bombs, torpedoes and ground crews, all working against the clock. That was the moment American dive bombers launched hours earlier off intelligence that traced straight back to Station HYPO arrived over the Japanese fleet. The first wave, torpedo squadrons, took brutal losses and accomplished little. But right behind them, SBD Dauntless dive bombers off Enterprise and Yorktown showed up almost simultaneously, and by pure chance they found the sky over Nagumo's carriers nearly empty. Japanese fighters had been pulled down low to deal with the torpedo planes. Within minutes, everything changed. Bombs tore into Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting fuel, armed aircraft, and stacked bombs on their hangar decks all at once. Fires spread past any hope of controlling them, and 3 of Japan's best carriers were gone as fighting ships within the hour. Hiryu, the last of the 4, held out until that afternoon, when American dive bombers found her too and left her burning. In a single day, Japan lost the carrier force that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor, and behind the wreckage sat a victory nobody could see won, that had actually been won weeks earlier by men reading numbers in a basement. 4. Turning Point, losing 4 frontline carriers in one day, staggered the Imperial Japanese Navy. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu weren't just ships, they were the same carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months before, and their loss did more than cost Japan hardware. It broke the momentum the Navy had built since the war began. For Yamamoto, the scale of the disaster took time to sink in. His fleet was scattered over hundreds of miles by design, so reports trickled in slowly and often contradicted each other. By the time the full picture came together, there was no way to salvage the battle. Instead of wiping out the American carriers, Japan had just suffered one of the worst defeats in its naval history. Back at Japanese headquarters, officers tried to make sense of it. How had the Americans known exactly where to be? Why were their carriers already sitting northeast of Midway before the attack even started? Some chalked it up to luck. Others blamed poor reconnaissance. Almost nobody suspected the real answer that American cryptanalysts had been reading enough of JN-25 to see the operation coming weeks ahead of time. The Japanese Navy did eventually suspect its communications had been compromised, and in the months after Midway it overhauled JN-25 new codebooks, new additive tables, tighter procedures. That reset sent Allied codebreakers back to square one on plenty of fronts. But by then, the US had built a mature, well-organized cryptographic operation. Station HYPO, Op-20G, and other Allied intercept teams adjusted to each new version of the code as it came. Breaking JN-25 was never something you finished it was an ongoing back and forth between people building ciphers and people determined to take them apart. Midway made something clear that would define the rest of the war. Naval battles could be shaped long before ships ever came within sight of each other. Intelligence had become a weapon in its own right, on par with carriers and submarines. One correctly read transmission could move entire fleets and decide campaigns spanning thousands of miles of ocean. From that point on, no major navy could treat code-breaking as some minor technical sideline. It had become one of the real battlegrounds of the war, an invisible front, where information, more often than firepower, decided who moved first. 5. Aftermath and historical impact. Midway didn't end the war in the Pacific, but it changed its trajectory. In a matter of days, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of experienced pilots, and the deck crews whose skills had taken years to build. Ships could be replaced. That level of trained personnel couldn't not quickly, and Japan's naval air arm never fully recovered from it. The United States, on the other hand, was only starting to show what its industrial base could do. Shipyards ramped up production of new Essex-class carriers, factories turned out aircraft by the thousands, and new pilots trained faster than Japan could match. Midway didn't just hand the US a battlefield win, it bought time. And that time let American industry and manpower start tilting the balance of the entire Pacific campaign. Station HYPO's success also changed how military leaders thought about intelligence itself. Nimitz later credited the codebreakers directly for the victory, and their work proved that intelligence could shift the outcome of a campaign just as much as ships or troops on the ground. For the rest of the war, Allied code-breaking kept feeding critical insight into Japanese operations, from the Solomons all the way to the Philippine Sea. For a long time, though, almost none of this was public. The scale of American cryptanalytic success stayed classified for decades, and the men who'd spent countless hours picking apart JN-25 got little recognition for it. Rochefort himself was pulled off Station HYPO only months after Midway, caught up in internal Navy politics, and it took years before historians properly credited what his team had actually pulled off. Today, breaking JN-25 ranks as one of the defining intelligence achievements of the Second World War. It's proof that wars aren't only won with ships and weapons, they're won with information. Every intercepted signal, every recovered code group, every carefully worked through message added up to something bigger. A picture clear enough to change the course of history. The victory at Midway happened in the sky over the Pacific, but it was built weeks earlier, in quiet rooms where mathematicians, linguists, and naval officers fought a battle almost nobody got to see. 6. Reflection/closing history tends to remember the noise, the guns, the roar of carrier aircraft, the smoke pouring off burning ships. Those are the images that stuck. But behind nearly every bomb that hit its mark was a quieter win, built on patience and stubborn analytical work rather than firepower. The men of Station HYPO never stood on a flight deck. Their tools were pencils, intercepted signals, and pages of numbers that looked like nothing at all. Working in cramped rooms under Pearl Harbor, they pieced together a puzzle plenty of people assumed was unsolvable, and their work gave American commanders the confidence to act before the Japanese fleet was ever visible on the horizon. Midway turned out to be more than a turning point in the Pacific War. It was the moment intelligence proved it could shape a battle as decisively as any weapon. From then on, every major military understood that protecting your own secrets and cracking the other side's could decide the fate of a war. The story of JN-25 is a reminder that some of the biggest victories in history aren't won on the front lines at all. They're earned quietly, through careful work, disciplined teamwork, and a willingness to trust the evidence even when the stakes are enormous. In the end, the code Japan believed was unbreakable didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because a small group of American codebreakers refused to accept that any mystery was beyond solving, and in doing that, they helped decide the outcome of the Second World War.